There are about 2.7 million UK landlords renting out their properties to tenants. One in 5 households in England and Wales are tenants. As at 2022, there were 4.6 million households renting their homes from private landlords. One of the risks UK landlords are exposed to is non-paying tenants. The number of claims brought by landlords against tenants are now on the increase. The most talked about topic in the UK buy-to-let market is the topic of rent arrears. There is nothing more divisive between landlord and tenant than this. So stay tuned as we explore this topic. Welcome to the Okri Property Show. In today's episode, we're going to talk about rent arrears in the buy-to-let market in the UK. Sadly, if you're thinking of becoming a landlord, one of the risks that you take is tenants not paying their rent or refusing to leave the property. In 2019, 3% of renters in the private rental sector failed to pay their rent. By 2020, that number had increased to 7%. The Ministry of Justice has a record that possession claim in the county court is now increasing. For instance, in 2022, 26,000 possession claims were brought in court. It can be very costly for landlords to bring possession claims. So one of the big questions is this: what should landlord do in terms of rent arrears? The number of evictions for non-payment of rent have been steadily rising in the UK. This is affecting 2.7 million private landlords managing over 8.7 million rental properties. An obvious explanation for this is the current state of the UK economy. Anil is a buy-to-let portfolio landlord renting out his properties to tenants.
There could be many reasons why tenants go into rental arrears. From my experience, I found two most common reasons. Number one being if the tenant is a business owner and if business is not running well, there you go. So there is this problem that can lead to not only rent but other bills as well. Second, employees. People lose jobs. There is a redundancy in the economy, in the sector. So there is a threat to their job. So they kind of want to save the money for the rainy day. So they might tend to keep the rents as a second priority, and then that could lead to rental arrears. But like I said before, if you work with the landlord beforehand and update your situation as what you're going through, either with the business or with your employment, an ideal landlord should just come up with a solution that works for both of them. Maybe they could come up with a plan where they could pay the rent not in one go, but multiple installments. So ideally, that's what I'm trying to tell is landlords and tenants, they both are entity together. They're not two separate entities. If that relationship have to be successful, they need to work in tandem. They cannot work in isolation and expect other person to just deal with it. If that is a situation that tenant leaves the landlord with, landlord unfortunately has no option but to take legal action or put some Section 8 or Section 21 notice, which is not a pleasant thing for the landlord as well. So I encourage open communication, be open, tell what's going on, and also make some payment just to prove that you are committed to pay the rent.
The various changes introduced by the government is also causing some buy-to-let landlords leaving the rental market. there are now fewer properties on the market, causing rent to rise.
To add, we're also seeing some buy-to-let landlords leaving the market, and they're being replaced with first-time buyers, and this is causing, again, a squeeze on supply. So for those looking to rent, they're not finding as many properties that there were in the past, because some of the bad buy-to-let landlords have moved because of the conditions that they're seeing right now. So yes, the state of the property market and the buy-to-let market presently in London, I would say that it's very interesting because a lot has changed since COVID, and what has happened now is there's been a high increase in serviced accommodation. This is where somebody would take a property and they would rent it for short let on sites like Airbnb and Booking.com. So we're based in Camberwell, and we have a lot of people coming from around the world who would like to come into Brixton because there's very good transport links. So we've seen a high conversion rate from normal assured short hold tenancies into these serviced accommodations, and this has really put a tight squeeze on the market. So though we've seen interest rates rising, and we've been seeing that it's more difficult for a lot of buy-to-let landlords coming in, we've also seen that the rental increase in the last year and the last year and a half has been it has exploded. We've been in this business almost 20 years, and in the recent times it's exploded incomparable to any other time, and that's because so many properties are now going into serviced accommodation. We have some people renting a one-bedroom flat, which would go in Brixton, for example, for 1,200. But at the same time, if you're using it for serviced accommodation, you're making almost £3,000 a month. So a lot of people are now taking their properties out of the normal market and moving it into serviced accommodation, which has restricted supply. And when supply is restricted, prices go up.
Lack of stock completely. There is certainly perhaps a few less landlords around where some of them have decided to sell. There is a huge amount of people looking to rent, partly because they haven't got the money to get on the property ladder to buy.
Yes.
So
yes.
The market for rentals has been flooded with potential tenants, therefore prices have shot up. It's supply and demand.
The increase of rent defaulters is now currently affecting some landlords.
The effects of rental arrears on the buy-to-let landlord community is a massive mess. Regardless of whether they pay the rents or time, landlord has a mandatory checklist that they need to do. We have to do that. There's no other go. Starting with mortgage payments. We have to pay the mortgage payments. We cannot risk them because we cannot take our credit history to down south. Secondly, we have to pay the service charges. We have to pay the ground rents. Regardless, if it's a property is a leasehold, we still have to do that. Third thing, we have to make sure the tenant is living in a safe and a nice environment. So what I mean by that is we still have to conduct repairs or any changes that we need to do, we still have to do that. However, like I said, if the tenant kind of shows the commitment by paying the rents in smaller chunks, that goes a long way for the landlord community. They would probably do this in pleasure than in displeasure.
Rents in the UK are going up at a significant pace since 2020. The average monthly rent in London is now £2,000. This is causing some tenants to fall into arrears. But what can a landlord do if tenant stops paying?
This is a very complicated question, and I would start with, you have to understand why, because if you don't know why a tenant isn't paying rent, then you can't solve the problem. You have to understand the mentality of the tenant. So first and foremost, if a tenant isn't paying rent, you have to give them a call. When they've gone arrears if they've been in arrears by 1 day, there should be a text message saying, sorry, have you forgotten? This is within the first 24 hours of rent arrears. Sorry, have you forgotten why you haven't paid rent? Sorry, just a reminder, your rent was due yesterday. Is something the matter? Was there a problem? If they haven't responded, then that same day you need to give them a call. Oftentimes it could just be an oversight. They could mention, oh, I was paid late, I'll pay first thing tomorrow morning. And you need to be as relatable and understandable as possible just to create a good environment and a good sort of relationship with your tenant. If things persist, then there's various ways that you need to go down. So for the first part, if a tenant doesn't respond to you when you send them a text message, you need to call them. And if you don't call them, you need to be very persistent very quickly. There has been cases in the past where we've had landlords who've come in off the street and have spoken about their tenant, and time has travelled, time has gone very far, and you need to document everything you're doing. Because if this goes to court, the communications you've had with your tenant are very important. So I'd say communication is key, and once you've understood the reason why the tenant isn't paying, you need to be persistently on their neck, on their tail, helping them to understand that of all their priorities of payment, where they live is the most important. Some people think that I need to, buy Christmas presents first. In Christmas, oftentimes people go into arrears because or holiday in the summer. Sometimes they want to go on holiday with their children, and they think, okay, we'll put the rent secondary, but it has to be primary, and they'll only understand that, some people, when you're pressing them, right? And if arrears continue to persist, things need to go into writing. It needs to be documented. So there's two routes normally if you're going to go to court. There's the Section 21 route, which is maybe coming to an end, and there's also the Section 8 route. So if your tenant is inside a assured short-hold tenancy agreement and it's still in the fixed term and they're not paying rent, you can go down the Section 8 route. The Section 8 route is basically saying that you're under a breach of tenancy, and there's various articles under that section which mentions, for example, if you're consistently late with the rent, or if you're in over 2 months arrears or over 8 weeks arrears, if you're paying inconsistently. Some of these are mandatory evictions where you go to the court and you speak to a judge, and the judge sees that your tenant is in more than 2 months arrears, and the judge will say, essentially, you have to leave. But this is a long process, so mediation and cooperation is always the first point of call. There's been a long backlog from coronavirus, and the court systems, especially in London, are overclogged. So if you wanted to evict somebody through a Section 21 route, or it's a Form 6A now, where you'll fill in and say, essentially, I want my property back for no reason, a no fault eviction, that will take at least a year. And there will be no court hearing unless the tenant has some reason to dispute why he's evicting you. Secondly, if you're going down the Section 8 route, this is when you're essentially saying you're in breach of tenancy. There will be a court hearing, and depending on the court that you file, which will be the closest one to where the property is, this also can take up to over a year. And there's a few documents that you must provide to them when they're moving in. Otherwise, the eviction is going to cost you a lot of money, and you'll pay their court fees. So you need to make sure that you've registered the deposit. Very important. You need to make sure that you've given them a gas safety certificate every year. You need to make sure that they've got an EICR, that's an electricity installation certificate report, and that basically says that the electronics and the electrics in the property has been done to a standard that is safe. And finally, when they're moving in and when you're renewing the tenancy agreement, you need to re-register the deposit, and you also need to provide them a booklet from the government called the How to Rent Guide. If you faltered on any of these points, then the eviction can drag on for a very long time. What to do? Step one, you need to communicate with your tenant. They need to be aware that this is not good. They can't prioritize other things. And then you need to make sure things are documented. You'll serve a notice, and the notice will say, if you haven't complied within this time, we're going to court, whether Section 8 or Section 21, which is the Form 6A at the moment. And once you've done that, I would recommend going to get a solicitor. So I would say that you have to understand that first and foremost, before you go to court, you have to exhaust every other avenue. You need to go to the guarantor. You need to make a payment plan, even if it's a percentage of the rent every month that they pay until the arrears are cleared. You need to mediate. You need to perhaps say, is there somebody who can support you in your family to make sure that you keep this roof over your head? Because eventually, if you go to court, it's a war, it's a battle, and it's not easy. And there's every hiccup in law to make sure it's difficult. Have you filed all the paperwork properly? Have you kept the property free from disrepair? Have you always addressed the tenant, or can they claim that you've been harassing them? These are the sorts of questions that will be asked and exposed in the court. So it's very difficult, and it's not something that you can do without great consideration and great care.
Many tenants are challenging evictions and believe there are other ways of dealing with rent arrears. In Kansas City, some tenants are now fighting evictions. Some landlords try to speak to their tenants to see how things could be resolved.
Like if tenants really stop paying the rents for not for once, but more than, it becomes a habit or repeating thing, the landlords have to call up the tenant or meet the tenant in the property, just to understand what's going on. What is the problem behind all this? So they have to come up with a solution that works both for the tenant and the landlord and see if they can agree to some kind of an arrangement. But if tenant is really in a deep mess, financial mess, and they cannot pay the rents for X number of months or whatsoever, just have another contract, draft another contract. See if you can wait for 3 months, if you can support the tenant for 3 months. Again, I always say this. While you are a buy-to-let landlord, you still have to have some empathy and compassion. You just cannot ignore that. You just cannot put legal pressure on the tenant right away. So have some kind of an arrangement, take a leeway and see where if tenant is coming back with some kind of a payment plan, if he's sticking to the payment plan. If the plan is going ahead, continue that until the situation becomes better with the tenant. If not, you only have one option, legal. That's not a great option for landlord, but hey, you have to do what you have to do.
The number of evictions being brought before the courts are steadily increasing, but this can be avoided if steps are taken earlier to prevent tenants falling into arrears. Prior to signing the tenancy agreement, it's important for landlords to obtain references about the tenants, assess the tenant's financial capacity, carry out credit checks, and ask for a guarantor.
I would say the first and foremost is picking the right tenant. This is an art and something that cannot be done lightly. With years of experience, we've come to realize that there are certain key factors that makes a good tenant from a bad tenant. I would say first and foremost, there are so many apps, there's so many services that you can use now in your tenancy, in your seeking of new tenants. And one thing that you can do is use these external referencing agencies that will reference your tenants. They'll check their pay slips, they'll check their bank statements, check their employment records, check to see whether they have CCJs. And then, most importantly, if they pass the referencing, these referencing agencies offer insured rent. This means that if they fall into rent arrears, while you're chasing the tenant, you can also be asking the external body to be covering the rent. And this has saved a lot of people money in the past. So what would happen is when your tenant goes into 1 week of arrears, you'll call the people who referenced your tenancy and who provided you with insurance, and you'll make a claim. And they will ensure that your rent is paid until the tenant has been evicted. So there's some key things that you need to look out for when you're renting a property. You need to get a reference from the last landlord to see have they kept the property in good order, have they paid their rent in time. Some people might not be honest, and they might say, yes, I was living with friends before, I was living with family before, so I didn't have a landlord, I can't provide a landlord's reference. And this is why bank statements are important, because normally if somebody's paying a rent, it will be a big chunk of their salary going out every month, and you can actually itemize the day of the month that it was going out. So for example, if they say they were living somewhere and the rent was due on the 1st of every month, in the bank statement, in the last 3 months, you should see on the 1st of every month that the rent was going out at the same time. And if that wasn't the case, that's a red flag which you need to look into. Secondly, you need to, what we do here, we hope that they earn at least 2.5 times the rent. So for example, if somebody's earning £2,500 a month, then we know that the max they can rent for is £1,000 a month. And that's the ratio that we normally use before we rent to somebody. And the guarantor must be earning 3.5 times the rent. If somebody is in a situation where you feel like this might not be the best tenant for your property, guarantors are normally the defining factor in this. Because if someone can get a guarantor someone who can agree to pay on their behalf, it means that there's something trustworthy about that person, something dependable about that person. There's been so many tenancies that have been in the balance, and once we've requested a guarantor, the tenant hasn't been able to find one. That means there's no one who can vouch for them. There's no one who can say, I can stand in their stead, and that has been ultimately a red flag for us, and has caused us not to grant the tenancy. So I would say that first and foremost, you should be using these agencies that can reference your tenants. You should be checking their bank statements to make sure that they're paying on time. You should be checking even council tax. Is there been a direct debit of council tax going out of their account? Have they been paying all the other bills on time? So once you see how they're paying their bills, once you see that their job is secure, is it a 0-hour contract? So that means tomorrow they might not have a job? Or are they under probation? Or have they got a fixed term contract or a permanent contract? These are the questions that will be asked and help us to ascertain the situation. And once that is understood, we can then decide whether or not this is a good tenant and will they fit the property that we're trying to rent to them.
For landlords concerned about tenant spending habits, having a standing order in place could also prevent arrears.
From my experience, having spoken with many buy-to-let landlords, I think the simplest things can actually bring a lot of mileage. By that I mean, have a standing order in place, or maybe have a guarantor. Second thing is, these basic things, they look very trivial, but then they will cover you. They will act as a shield when these rental arrears come in place. Third thing, which a lot of landlords kind of underplay that, is have a good relationship with the tenants. Make sure the property is in a nice condition. If they come with any problems or issues, act upon it on time and make sure they live in a safe place. They should feel that the landlord is responsible. And when you do all these things, there's a chance that they may make rents a priority and then not let this slip into rental arrears.
The UK buy-to-let market is in a turmoil state at the moment. I'm on my way to speak to a tenant about rent arrears.
Narendra is a tenant living in a 2-bedroom apartment with his family. He has been living in his apartment for over a year.
Yeah, I found it very challenging for tenants to pay rent in time because we have seen in the COVID that the inflation was very down and now it has gone up. So we are finding it very difficult to catch up with the rates which are going up with the tenants. So that's the only problem. So if the rates, if the landlord and the tenants are agreeing on some agreeable rates, and it's good for them to pay, and it all depends on the relationship between the landlord and the tenants. As long as the relationship is good, then the payment and the tenants will be living good in the property. They will enjoy the property.
Good. You mentioned about the good relationship. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, relationship is one part, and the legal contract is another part by which the tenant is bound to pay the rent. So as long as the tenant is paying the rent, the relationship will keep on continuing and it will be the good relationship. So rent has to be paid at time.
We've come to the end of the episode. If you're a tenant and you're struggling with your rent, it's best that you take advice from the Citizens Advice Bureau. They will tell you what benefits you're entitled to. And of course, you could apply for universal credit if you're in part-time work or in low-paid work. You could apply for housing benefit, or possibly you could get council tax discount where you get 25% discount. And that savings you could use towards your housing cost. And so that's it for today. If you want to find out more, you could find out on our website, Instagram, and on Facebook. Until next time, goodbye from me.
Okri Property Show.
Show.
Brought to you by Menvo Homes Limited.
The Okri Property Show.